headlines predicting crises and breaking out, et cetera, et cetera. In some situations, more situations than not, that's not the case. But in some situations, you can't get information out of the country because the government won't let you, because they don't want to be seen as being inadequate. So how do you share that information with your operational people when you're prescribed by the people you're presuming to serve from even using it? You fall back on assumptions. You fall back on, you know I'm going to need this because cholera is going to break out if I don't have that. You know that I'm going to need this in a trauma situation because if I don't have enough antibiotics, et cetera, et cetera. You almost create a model for each disaster, a model which you then impose upon reality, and if you're flexible, you let that model change as necessary. If you're not flexible, you stick to it, and then someone replaces you the next time around. But basically, NGOs have a combination of being able to live within flexibility to the extent that donors will allow them to, and also having much more coherent models of behavior because the restrictions on their overall performance are pretty severe. Uses of information. During the famines in Bahr el-Ghazal, for example, the press seized upon, the world press seized upon a recognition that thousands and thousands of people were moving from one part of Sudan to another, and that in some cases they were walking for 30, 40 days, basically without food or water except as they could find along the way, which you can imagine was pretty dire. So, in conjunction with the World Food Program, a series of airdrops were initiated into various locations. And as far as the world press was concerned, the airdrop success or lack of success was defined in terms of metric tonnage per week. Okay? And at one point, the number, let's say 100 metric tons a week, it was considerably more than that, but let's say that was the number, was accomplished, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief. But then reports began to filter back information that morbidity and mortality had not declined in those areas where the airdrops were impacting. The press came to the conclusion that, okay, it must be because the military operating in those areas is appropriating the food. Perhaps. Finally, it turned out an assessment team from UNICEF was finally able to get out there, and it turned out that it was a combination of a couple of things which no one had taken into account. Yes, the food was reaching the families, but the families were sharing it with the fighters. So the women and children were getting half of what we thought they were getting it, because the rest of it was being distributed to fighters who were moving all over the place. And so the numbers, the metrics that we were using were seriously flawed by the fact that we had no sense of what the distribution patterns actually were. Total failure of information. Now, arguably, if we'd had that information, what would we have done with it? Would we have increased the amount of tonnage? But then the press would have jumped on us and said, wait a minute, you're feeding men with guns, but that's beyond your mandate. What would we have done with the information? I found myself reflecting in hindsight if we had had it at the time. That's the sort of dilemma that faces, again, the humanitarian system. I don't have any idea how I'm doing my time. 15? Okay. I told you early on that I was going to be speaking from prepared notes, but in case you hadn't noticed, I haven't turned a page. I don't know what that says, but let me I spoke about conditionality, and I spoke about situations which compromise people's ability to perform well for either normative or whatever reasons. Let me speak about the elements of the community which make the system, to my mind, much more a part of, if you will, the real world. If I think about our situation in northern Iraq, for example, during the first Gulf War, we were in the mountains on the Turkish side initially and then into Iraq when the Kurdish exodus began. And The thing that was frustrating was that we had very little ability to move. We could see pockets of people visible, but they were on the other side of a mountain range. Now, sure, we could get over there, but how much can you carry trekking across a mountain? The military, because there was so much public pressure in the U.S., because in the minds of the U.S. public, the U.S. government had allowed the Kurds to be massacred by Saddam Hussein after encouraging them to rise up against him, there was a strong overriding sense of guilt. So the military was tasked with assisting in this humanitarian supply chain well beyond their expectations. But of course, they were not on the ground, we were. So two things happened. One, after much wrangling with Washington, they allowed us to use their helicopters. And the military was more than happy to, but the civilian side of government was afraid, well, what if a helicopter crashed with a bunch of relief workers? Oh my God, et cetera, et cetera. So we finally worked our way through that. But more importantly, they provided us, in addition to getting to where we needed to go, material. Tons and tons and tons of material went into the mountains in northern Iraq, provided free by the military. So those are the halcyon days of a very clear relationship with the military logistics capability, which made all the difference in what we could do. We couldn't move all the PVC piping we needed to move the water. For them, it was just no big deal. And so a lot of things were enabled by that relationship. Okay. Things change. Following that series of events, NGOs, Catholic Relief Services, CARE, my NGO, we were happy to be involved with training exercises at various places like Fort Polk, Fort Bragg, and so forth, where the military was involved in humanitarian. We would play beneficiaries, or role play, that is, beneficiaries or the providers, just so the military would get a sense of the interaction within the community. And that was going fine. Then came Afghanistan, the first beginning of the Afghanistan conflict. What happened? In Afghanistan, special forces began distributing humanitarian supplies and civilian clothing. The shock waves that went to the NGO and humanitarian system were enormous because, of course, there was a concern, how could the, quote, bad guys, unquote, distinguish between soldiers and NGOs? And so that went on, and the relationship with the military and the humanitarian community turned 180 degrees the other way. So we started from square one. And I'm bringing this up because in terms of the scale of the events, and getting back to the slide that I asked to be dropped, the magnitude of these events is well beyond the capability of organizations as they're structured now to respond to. What we saw in the Pakistan earthquake, the kind of movements, only things you can only do with helicopters and that sort of activity. The sort of supplies that had to be shifted in Haiti, the need for some control to take over the operational system to some extent was obvious. The problem is that the communities don't necessarily trust each other anymore. They don't necessarily believe in the credibility of the others. They ascribe motivations correctly or incorrectly, one to the other. But the point is, underlying all of that, is that unless these obstacles are overcome, we're simply not going to be able to cope with the reality of the scale of disasters. Katrina in the U.S. was a total failure simply because no one knew how to use the resources that they had available. So what has happened in the meantime in a positive way is that guidelines have developed between the NGO community and the military community in the U.S. under the auspices of the U.S. Institute of Peace and Interaction, the NGO consortium. These guidelines govern military action, relations with the military in conflict situations, and a key part of it is that the use of military assets is understood by both sides to be seen as a last resort. The UN has developed similar guidelines, and they relate as well to disaster response. But the point I'm making is that the humanitarian system, community, has expanded to become part of the real world in ways that we were never initially expected to be part of or designed to be part of. Private sector involvement. Kosovo. A lot of the radios that we use were given free by the private sector. You know, some of the satellite imagery was provided free. A lot of things are free by the private sector. Now, we're under no illusions that all of this was done out of the goodness of their respective corporate hearts. Some was, but by the same token, some of the corporations, say in the tsunami area and certainly in Japan, recognize that they're part of things which they can only control to the extent that they can collaborate with others. And therefore, there's a willingness to be interchangeable, to be interactive, but it needs to be fostered. And I think technology, transparent, predictable, and available technology is certainly one of the platforms that's used on the assumption that the predicates for its use are understood. Finally, I assume that finally is an appropriate phrase. Okay. I refer to the human factor. Now, a colleague of mine came up, well, let me give you a little anecdote, which reinforces, I think, what I was trying to say before. I remember we were working on the Thai-Cambodian border, and this young woman who was part of my staff, whose parents had been American diplomats, so she'd spent most of her life in Asia, came up to me one morning and said, "Roy, I think I'm losing my soul." And my first thought was, I wasn't quite sure how she was using the word soul. And then I realized that the work we were doing and the experiences were causing her to have a very different view of who she was. And that stayed with me for a long time, because I hadn't fully, being a good West Indian, and you're taught not to pay any attention to these emotional nonsense fluffs, you know, I was struck by the fact that, yes, we are tampering with people's souls in ways and forcing them to define or redefine themselves in ways for which they were not prepared. The other thing that sticks in my mind as a reminder as to what this business is all about is a friend of mine came up with the notion of a humanitarian virus. And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, let's say that there's a contagious virus. Anyone who defines himself as a humanitarian is struck by it. It's fatal." And I said, "Oh, so if you think of yourself as doing humanitarian work, the virus will find out. You're in trouble." So I found myself saying, okay, given all the problems in the world, we still want to deal with the problems in the world, but we can't do it in a humanitarian way? He said,